Luckily, Henry didn't ask what he needed a minute to do, because Vlad really had no idea. To Vlad's surprise, his fangs stayed safely tucked into the soft tissue of his gums all through history class and study hall. His stomach rumbled loudly as he entered room 6, his homeroom as well as his English classroom at the end of the day. But his fangs stayed put, and the bell eventually rang, releasing him from the oppression that was junior high. Henry had waved to Vlad on his way to another student council meeting, so Vlad hung out near his locker after the bell. Vlad didn't even see Tom and Bill coming before Tom had a handful of Vlad's shirt twisted into his fist. Tom's breath smelled like peppermint, which wasn't altogether unpleasant. Behind him, Bill was huffing up his shoulders and looking both ways down the hall for anyone who might interfere. "What are you waiting for, goth boy?" Tom shook Vlad once before pressing him hard against the locker. Vlad was trying his best not to open his mouth, not for fear of what he might say, but because he could feel a gnawing urge to bite Tom out of spite. He ran his tongue over his teeth and found his fangs poking out, reacting to the subtle scent of blood rushing beneath Tom's skin. "I'm not goth." Tom pulled him away from the locker and slammed him up against it again, sending a loud clang into the hall. "What?" Vlad straightened his shoulders. "I said I'm not goth." Tom looked back at Bill, who rolled his eyes. When Tom turned back to Vlad, his eyes were rolling too. "You goth sack of crap. You don't even know you're goth." Not that Vlad had anything against being goth, really. He'd seen the goth kids hanging around the steps of Bathory High at night, cloaked in black and looking for a way out of small-town life. They weren't so different from him, with their black hair, black clothes, and dark humor. In fact, Vlad had secretly wished he would be lucky enough someday to find friends that seemed so like him. Henry was great, but sometimes it was really hard being his shadow. Tom shook him again, apparently not satisfied that Vlad wasn't quivering with fear. But Vlad, despite preferring almost everything else to spending a moment with Tom, wasn't feeling very afraid. In fact, he wasn't feeling afraid at all. He was feeling hungry. Holding his breath, Vlad pushed with his mind. Then, with a strange, dizzying rush of blood to his head, he began to feel completely irritated. What was this kid's problem, anyway? Why wasn't he crying and begging to be let go? And what was he staring at? Tom glanced over his shoulder at Bill, who merely shrugged. He pulled back his fist. One quick punch would do it, and then he could slip down the hall to his mom's waiting car. Mom would be a real pain if he was late for ballet. He hated dance. All those frou-frou boys and the stupid leotard. But she kept making him go. 3 years apparently hadn't been enough. At least Bill didn't know. Bill thought he was going to his uncle's every Friday to learn how to make pipe bombs. If he knew the truth... Vlad smirked and felt his mind pull out of Tom's thoughts. It had been easy. Maybe it was the hunger that made it easy. Without a glance at Tom's fist, he whispered, "You'd better hurry, ballerina boy. You wouldn't want to be late." Tom blinked. He lowered his fist and looked back at Bill, who was punching his palm and eyeing Vlad. Vlad's smirk spread into a smile. What would Bill say if he knew you were dancing around in tights with other guys? Think he'd be open-minded? Understanding? Vlad followed Tom's gaze to Bill, who'd stopped practicing on his fist and was looking at Tom, expectantly. Vlad pressed his lips together, despite the gnawing urge to flash his fangs. Tom relaxed his grip on Vlad's shirt and stepped back. He grabbed Bill's sleeve and they moved down the hall away from Vlad. Bill was whispering questions, but Tom silenced him with a shove. In the window across from where he stood, Vlad caught his reflection. He looked paler, older, and positively fierce. He smiled, revealing his perfect white fangs. It had turned out to be a good day after all. 6. Secrets and Sanctuary. Dressed as I am, what do I look like to you? Mr. Otis looked about the classroom. Several students fiddled with objects on their desks in response. Some met his gaze with glazed eyes of indifference. Come on, first thing that pops into your head. A small voice broke the silence. A homeless guy? Stephanie Braun shot her hand up. Her tone was matter-of-fact. A mortician. A zombie, Carl squeaked. Carl was one of the quieter students. Lanky, shy. It always surprised Vlad to hear his voice. Mr. Otis pointed a long finger at Carl. His eyes twinkled. Yes. As you seemed to enjoy my unicorn costume last week and my troll costume the week before, I thought I'd choose something a bit less obvious this time. I wore this as inspiration for the project we'll be undertaking this week. Mr. Otis turned to his bag, where he retrieved a hefty stack of papers and began passing them to each student. Once the papers were handed out, he returned to his perch on the corner of his desk, a proud smile on his face. He searched their eyes, obviously expecting wonderment and curiosity, but his smile slipped when he found only disappointment. Even Vlad, who'd come to enjoy having Mr. Otis as a teacher over the past few weeks and found the study of such things fascinating, slumped down in his seat. New projects always started out sounding cool, but before you knew it, the teacher had glitter and construction paper strewn about the room, and you were getting fitted for some stupid costume. Vlad decided that teachers' ideas were a lot like bunches of garlic, intriguing from afar, but up close, sadly sickening, and if you weren't careful, deadly. Still, he felt sorry for Mr. Otis, who, like so many substitutes, was trying to make an impression. Vlad raised his hand and asked, Will this be an oral report or written? I'm glad you asked. Mr. Otis glanced down at the papers on his desk and back at the class. Since I first began teaching you, we've been learning the folklore and history of a different mythological creature every week. This week, we will embark on the study of supernatural beings, and at the end of our studies, you will each be turning in a 1,000-word essay on one of those supernatural creatures, as well as giving an oral presentation near the end of February. Mr. Otis turned to the blackboard with a spring in his step and scribbled down a list of slightly crooked words. He turned back to the class and nodded at the intrigued looks he saw on their faces. Reaching into his bag, he retrieved a handful of small, folded papers. Mr. Otis stuffed them into his hat and said, These will be no ordinary reports. I want you to write them as if you were the creature you draw from my hat. Tell me how you feel, what your strengths are, your weaknesses, any special abilities you may have. Tap into what makes you a witch, a werewolf, a vampire, and so on. Show me the true nature of yourself. Vlad sank farther into his seat. Hiding his true nature was a daily chore, and certainly not something he wanted to expose in front of the class. People would panic. Meredith would cringe. And he could only imagine how closely Principal Snellgrove would watch him after learning his secret. As Mr. Otis began his slow trip around the room, stopping at each desk and holding out the hat, Vlad crossed his fingers under the desk and hoped that the mathematical odds would be with him, and he'd draw zombie or warlock, anything but his true nature. In front of him, Chelsea Whittaker was pouting over her pick. She lifted her furrowed brow to Mr. Otis, who merely smiled and held the hat out to Vlad. Vlad reached in and pulled out a slip of paper. Vlad cupped it in his hand, willing it to read anything but vampire. He took a deep breath, held it until his lungs burned, and opened his hand. The paper was blank. Vlad blinked, and when he looked up at Mr. Otis, he noticed that his teacher was watching the slip of paper with decided interest. Feeling more than a little curious and only slightly stupid, Vlad flipped the paper over and read his assigned creature. Werewolf. A sigh escaped Vlad before he realized it was he who'd made it. At the moment, he couldn't think of a more pleasant word to read, and so he read it once again. Werewolf. He could do werewolf. Howling at the moon, fear of all things silver, inexplicable urge to sniff the butts of people he met on the street. Oh yeah, piece of cake. Mr. Otis's hand clenched into a tight fist. Then, just as Vlad's muscles relaxed, the letters scrawled on the small rectangle of paper blurred. At first, Vlad thought his eyes were simply losing focus, so he squeezed them closed. But when he opened them again, the letters were rearranging themselves.
This is the end of disc number 1. Please insert disc number 2.